guests, ladies and gentlemen. It's a great pleasure to be here at the invitation of Professor Roberto Veronese. I worked at the European Institute of Oncology in Milan. I was the first employee there for 11 years. It was a great pleasure to work with the professor at that point and to see the range of not only his work with patients, which was magnificent, but also the breadth of his interest and his intellect, and I think this shows up here. We're going to talk about, been asked to talk about health, and health and science are both intertwined, and we'll see at the end, when we summarise what I'm going to say, the importance of much more application of science into the health area to bring about major changes. I think the first thing we've got to say today is we've got a huge problem with global public health. I'm not talking about health in Europe or high-resource countries. We're talking about global public health, the health of the world. We've got currently 7 billion people alive on the planet. 1 billion people do not have access to clean drinking water, and 2 billion people do not have access to sanitation. 1 billion people are hungry today, not starving, but 1 billion people out of 7 billion are hungry today, and 1 billion people, further 1 billion people, are undernourished. 1/3 of all the city dwellers live in a slum, and the race to find ways to feed and supply clean water and sanitation to the rapidly growing population, climate change is going to present a major challenge. The crops that we grow in any country of the world today, Italy, France, Germany, are going to be completely different from what we grow in 20 years' time as a result of climate change. So what's the problem? What's the size of the problem? This is a recent report from the Indian Census. This is from the National Census Institute in India, which is the government report. They discovered that the population of India is 1.2 billion. There are 246 million households. Of the households, 46.9% have lavatories, which means that more than half don't. 63% have a telephone, 47% have a television. There's more households have a television than a lavatory. Of the population, these are households, of the population, half of the population still defecate in public, and 53.2% have a mobile phone so they can talk to each other while they're doing this. So, India is not by any means the worst country in the world, but it just shows you here the problems that we've got to face up to in public health. This is from an Oxfam report. The number of people who are hungry in the world, there's about 1 billion people, as I said earlier, hungry in the world, and this has hardly changed since 1970. The proportion may be lower, but the number of people who are hungry today has not changed over the last 40 years. One of the great dangers that we're facing up to is here we take 2002 to 2004 as the baseline, unity to 100. There have been, after the cost of food, this is from the Food and Agricultural Organization of the United Nations in Rome. You see here, after remaining constant from 1990 up until about 2000, the price of food is now 2.5 times more expensive today than it was 10 years ago. This is bad news, bad news for the world. So, how do we stop people dying? Well, each year there are approximately 20 million deaths in each of the age groups, 0 to 34, 35 to 69, and 70 and older. We cannot prevent death. Life is a sexually transmitted disease which is invariably fatal. What we're interested in is premature death. And premature death is death before old age, ages up to 69. And deaths aged 0 to 5 and middle age, we've got to consider them separately. But big concentration, we want to avoid premature deaths up to the age of 69. We'll split it up and look at 0 to 5 and look at middle age 35 to 69 separately. Because 2/3 of all deaths globally occur before the age of 69. There was a huge harumph, party, etc. within UNICEF, UNESCO, the Lancet last year when they announced that the number of deaths in children aged less than 5 had declined to below 10 million. It was 9.95 million. That's just, if you look at take the European Union figures and apply that to the world, then it'd only be about 450,000 deaths in children. So although we can pat ourselves on the back and say, yeah, we got it below 10 million, it's still enormously high. So these are the deaths from children under the age of 5. It's about 10 million. The main causes are neonatal, respiratory, diarrhea. 2 million kids die every year from diarrhea, which is just ridiculous. Others, malaria, measles, HIV/AIDS, and injuries. Apart from these vertical causes of death, underlying this is the contribution, 3.6 million of these deaths from undernutrition. The drama here is that 99% of these deaths in children occur in low and lower middle income countries, and 95% of those deaths are preventable. Without research, it's just a matter of preventing it. We know how to prevent them, and it's about time we actually started to do something rather than just talk about it. The future, even in low-resource countries just now, is going to be in chronic diseases. Diabetes, cancer are going to be huge problems for the lower-income countries. Diabetes is going to swamp cancer as the major chronic disease of the future. The numbers of people with diabetes and the increase which is taking place is just phenomenal. And yet, there's a horror story. If you look at Africa, it's a huge problem. A diabetic in Mozambique, not the worst country in Africa in terms of health by any means, but a diabetic in Mozambique who requires insulin injections will probably live no more than 1 year. In Mali, the average lifespan after onset of diabetes is 30 months. In Turkey, in Western countries, diabetics can have an almost normal life expectancy if they're well treated and their diabetes is controlled. Prevalence of diabetes has increased from 30 million cases globally to 250 million in 2010 over a period of 20 years. 50 million Chinese alone are now diabetic. There are 40 million diabetics in India. In the Middle East countries, the prevalence of diabetes in the population approaches 20%. It's 25% in Dubai and Kuwait, but overall it's 20%. 1 adult in 5 in the Middle East countries has diabetes. The other huge problem we're facing is the growth, but also the ageing of the population. What we're seeing in emerging economies, the so-called tiger economies that are pushing ahead, is suddenly there's a huge acceleration in the ageing of the population. For some reason, demographers and geographers use the index of speed of aging as you wait until 7% of the population are aged 65 and over. In France, that occurred in 1865. And then you wait till that doubles to 14%. Why, I don't know, but these are the figures. The doubling time from 7% to 14% of over 65. You can see that in France it took 115 years, Sweden it took 85 years, Australia 73 years, United States 69 years, Canada 65 years. In the old established Western industrialised economies, it took decades, real long periods of time. But in these tiger economies, Singapore is going to double in 19 years, 20 years in Colombia, 21 years in Brazil, etc., up to 26 years in China. There's a rapidity of the ageing of the population in these hugely emerging economies, and it's a rapidity of ageing that we've never ever seen before. The consequence is going to be that when we look at the population in the year 2000 compared to 2030, we expect it to go from 6.1 billion to 8.3 billion. These are the number of men, number of women. This is the population pyramid, 0 to 4, 5 to 9, 10 to 15, etc., up to 85 plus. You can see that the population is going to grow by about 2 billion in 30 years, which is a challenge. But not only is it going to grow, it's going to grow older, and you can see this remarkable change in the shape of the population pyramid as we get more and more people advancing to middle ages, the ages at which cancer and other chronic disease become major public health problems. In the whole history of the planet, demographers are a little bit confused between whether there was 80 or 120 billion people who've ever lived in the population. Let's call it 100 billion people have ever lived. There are currently 1 billion people aged over 65 today, and that's going to grow rapidly. By 2080, it's projected to be 1 million people aged over 100. But think for a minute, of all these 100 billion people that have ever lived, of all those who've reached the age of 65, 2/3 of them are alive today. We're living in an era and an epoch where we've got no past experience in which to guide us and how to cope with this elderly, aging population. Of all the 100 billion people that have ever lived, and of all those who have reached the age of 65, 2/3 of those are alive today. Consequences are enormous. I'm not going to mention tobacco. I can talk for 2 hours of tobacco, but 1/3 of all cancer deaths are due simply to tobacco. And that's the fight that we've got to fight in the low and lower middle income countries at present. Because the tobacco epidemic that started there 20, 30 years ago, there's a 40-year gap between a big change in tobacco and a big change in diseases and deaths related to tobacco. And we're just beginning to see the growth of that in the poorer countries. But one of the big discoveries in the last 20 years has been the association between chronic infection and cancer. In the developed countries, 8% of all cancers can be related to chronic infection, H. pylori, human papillomavirus, Epstein-Barr virus, and HIV, HHV. So it's becoming important in our countries to recognise in the high-resource countries that. But in the developing countries, 28% we estimate of all cancers are related to chronic infection. And that's something which, of course, will change as tobacco comes through, the effects of that. But you can see here the scope which exists for prevention. If you look at Africa, the third commonest incident form of cancer in Africa is liver cancer. The second commonest is cervix cancer. The commonest cancer in Africa is Kaposi sarcoma. And all these are theoretically preventable by either vaccination or by some other intervention, but they're all theoretically preventable. The other problem with infection is the huge problem that we're having in Africa in particular. This is estimates of AIDS in 2003. You can see that the great majority of cases of HIV/AIDS occur in sub-Saharan Africa. And it's completely changed the demographic profile of Africa. This is a typical African family. Here you can see the children with their grandmother. The parents are dead, typically died of AIDS, and the grandfather too has probably died of AIDS. So it's changing the whole familial structure of families. One of the consequences is that today there are currently 75 million orphans in Africa due to AIDS. And that's a very special group that we haven't really got our act together and tried to do something for them, because that's a group of people who are coming through now with significant challenges to provide them with good health care, because nobody wants them. And that's a 75 million strong group. That's bigger than most countries of the world. And that's certainly an area that we have neglected and we need to do something with. So health and peace, I think, go hand in hand. Health and science go hand in hand. This is we can give you the map if you want, but a man born in France in 1890, all the gains in life expectancy which were brought about by the great social engineering changes and medical progress in the first half of the 20th century were lost due to the two great European wars. So politics, peace, war, the opposite of peace, that had a huge influence on life expectancy of a man in France or Germany or the United Kingdom, born at the end of the 19th century. But equally bad is this observation. For United Kingdom doctors, there was a huge study started in 1950, followed UK doctors and it had to stop after 50 years because all those who smoked cigarettes were dead. For United Kingdom doctors born in the early part of the 20th century, all the gains in life expectancy brought about by the fantastic medical progress in the second half of the century were lost among those doctors who continued to smoke after 1950. So you can see the impact of politics, which causes war, and you can see the impact of huge public health disasters on what happens to overall global life expectancy. This is the drama for this is diabetes in the world from 2010 to 2030. The global burden is going to grow from about 284 million in 2010 to 450 million in 2030. Overall, a 50% increase in the prevalence or the incidence of diabetes. And the darker the colour here, the greater the risk, the greater the increase. You can see small increases going to take place in Europe, China, Australasia, etc. A little bit more in Central and South America, but the disaster area here is Africa and the Middle East. And we've already seen that the chances of surviving diabetes are very, very low, even in good countries like Mali and Mozambique. So we've got a double challenge there to try and prevent it, but also to try and make sure there's adequate treatment, but the implications for resources is phenomenal. Spoke a little bit also about ageing, the impact of growth of the population and ageing on cancer. Is in 2008 we calculated there's 12.5 million new cases of cancer, 7.6 million deaths from cancer in 2008, and 28 million people alive within 5 years of a cancer diagnosis in 2008. But because of the growth, the ageing of the population, and also the increase in cancer incidence, the risk which is going to take place in the lower resource countries with the arrival of the tobacco problem, we see that in 2030 it's going to go from 12 million to 26.4 million new cases of cancer each year, 17.1 million deaths, and 80 million people around the world alive within 5 years of a cancer diagnosis. The implications of that on treatment and treatment costs and hospitals and doctors is going to be phenomenal. It's something we should have been planning for the last 20 years, but as yet no one has started the planning process for the epidemic of cancer which is coming, or the epidemic of diabetes which is coming throughout the world. One of my great friends, Stephen MacArthur, is a Presbyterian minister, and he quoted the Sermon on the Mount. He changed it a little bit to say, "Blessed are the peacemakers, not the peace hopers." We can all sit comfortably and say, "Yeah, I hope this works, yeah, it's a great idea." But unless we get up off our seat and actually do something, it's not going to work. We've got to actually make peace rather than just hope that it comes about. We've got an urgent need to change the mindset to deal with prevention. The time for hoping is past. We really need to have some action. And we need governments to take the lead and set prevention actions as a top priority. There are areas where legislation has worked. Professor Veronese and I worked on the European Tobacco Directive and the tobacco law in Italy, which has been great. They're effective public health measures. But we've really got to look at everything we can to make changes. I think the situation for cancer patients in low-income countries is critical and set to deteriorate. There's just no resources. I think that committee sitting, report writing, spreading peppercorn monies around in an uncoordinated manner is a failed model which needs to change. And it's critical to move to action, to mobilise the enormous goodwill and resources which exist, because they do exist, and attack the problem at its heart. We've really got to have coordinated and effective action. But can we do anything? We need to reduce premature death in the world. We see that we know what to do, and we only need to implement what we know to reduce the number of deaths that occur in children under the age of 5. Between 5 and 35 it's different. There's road traffic accidents, there's accidents, HIV/AIDS. That's going to be more difficult. But the big win will come when we look at the middle age, the 35 to 69. More than half of the world's deaths in middle age can be prevented by steps to prevent cancer, either by vaccination or lifestyle changes such as elimination of cigarette smoking, or the elimination of cigarette smoking and cardiovascular disease through disease, control of hypertension, blood lipids and lifestyle changes. Let's give one frank thing that we know we can do. A 20 millimetre of mercury reduction in systolic blood pressure. That's the one that your cardiologist isn't so interested in. A 20 millimetre reduction in systolic blood pressure halves vascular mortality between the age of 35 and 69. Simple. To achieve that worldwide, we would halve vascular mortality, which is the commonest cause of death in middle age. We're fairly certain that we've followed up 1 million people, and we've got 100,000 deaths to back that up. So we know that we can do that. There's other things that we can do to halve premature mortality. We've got to get the big issues correct. Let's worry about the little ones later, but let's get the big issues correct. The knowledge exists to halve premature mortality worldwide. We only need to do it. We must avoid catastrophic war, famine, pestilence, social collapse, because that again will be set us back like the First World War and the Second World War in Europe, set back life expectancy in participating countries. We need to make effective treatments progressively more widely accessible worldwide, and that's a huge challenge for everyone included. And just remember, it's better to have a moderate reduction in a big cause than a big reduction in a small one. We've really got to avoid confusing the few big with the many smaller causes. If you've got this lying like this on your desk, it's totally worthless if you want to know what time it is. So we've got to put all the pieces together and get them to work in a coordinated manner. And it's exactly the same for global public health. The first thing we need to take into the spring of everything going forward is climate change. Because we've got to adapt that, we've got to provide water and sanitation for a growing population, and we've got to avoid hunger. These are two major components that are going to be dictated by climate change. But we need that for global public health. But also for global public health, we need to look at cancer, diabetes, and cardiovascular disease, and that's a big cog in this whole project. And we also need to look at HIV/AIDS, malaria, tuberculosis, which is an equally big cog. But the most important thing is we've got to put them all together. This here little watch costs about $60,000 if you want to buy it new, but sitting in the various bits on your desk is absolutely worthwhile. worthless. And that's exactly the situation with global public health. Unless we get all the bits, get together, get some coordinated action, we're not going to make very much progress. We've also got to concentrate on prevention, because the very famous Scottish physician said in 1618, prevention is so much better than healing because it avoids the labour of being sick. Thank you very much for your attention.
Sayın